So let's take it from the top. My name is Robert. I do have a beard because it's kind of mandatory if you're male and a developer. And I also have it because otherwise there's some wrong connections here. So I do want to make sure how I stand out. I'm from Sweden, which basically means I do try to travel as much as possible. And it's kind of a rule like that if you're Swedish and you travel, you need to travel anywhere where it's warmer, which is basically everywhere. Although it is a bit cold in San Francisco, so I'm not entirely happy with the outcome so far. I work for Mozilla and I run the Mozilla Hacks blog. And then basically with the Mozilla Hacks blog, we write about things in general about the open web. So it's not only things that we work on with or at Mozilla, it's about everything that could be good with HTML5 or JavaScript or anything that's open web based. And usually when I give a presentation, people ask afterwards about Mozilla and what Mozilla actually is and what we do. So I guess it needs to be pointed out that Mozilla is a non-profit organization. And the reason for, or main reason for Mozilla for existing is basically to make sure that the web stays open. We want to make sure that not just one player has complete control over the entire playing field, which is kind of interesting with the keynote we had next door this morning with the big fruit. And what we work with is just to make sure that we have open standards and that we have everything well-based and spread out, so it is a good balance. And part of that, of course, is that we make a web browser. And usually when people wonder about Firefox, and especially when Chrome comes up as well, like, oh, you know, it must really suck that Chrome has gotten so much market share in only a couple of years. And on the contrary, I think that's a great thing. I think we don't want to have 100% market share with Firefox or any other web browser. I think what we're starting to see right now with web browsers is a good balance. We actually have proper competition right now. And if you just look at JavaScript, for instance, the performance increase we had in the last few years is amazing. So I think competition is great, and I'm really happy that Chrome is having the uptake. Of course, I'm happy that we're having a good user base with Firefox as well. I think that's quite nice. We also try to bring awareness to people. So we have a few projects working with people being aware of integrity and their data online. So basically, how do we make sure that people know what they're sharing? And of course the main thing is, and then people usually ask, like, oh no, whatever, Facebook is evil or something like that. That's not really the point. It's just more about what you put out there is going to be available for anyone. So just be aware of that and how you work with it. We also try to stay on top of trends. So what's happening on the web right now? What was it like before? And where are we going? How can we actually make this better? And especially now with mobile, how can we adapt to the things that are happening in that field? And I think, and sort of referring to the next door keynote again, I think one important thing to think about as well is kind of the climate we have worldwide. So if we look in the Western world, we sort of have something like, well, sort of paraphrase from Fight Club, that buying things we don't need with money we don't have to impress people we don't like. And the world is so much bigger than that. And if you just go way beyond the, well, US and Western Europe and such, people don't have the same economic circumstances at all. And if you look at New York Times, for instance, I think the average number of devices a subscriber has is 6 different devices to access the content that they share. So I think in this sense, and sort of where we'll be going, it's how can we make sure that everyone can take part of the web? How can everyone access the content and contribute with their own content during this or under the same circumstances? And I like this quote from Mike West, who works for Google, that we're all idiots with deadlines. And I think that's what mobile has turned into. That we got this big mobile hype a few years ago, and people just clung onto it and well, doing all kinds of things just to be a part of it. You don't want to miss the train of mobile, which of course led to some kind of a destructive behavior as well. I can't really motivate having this picture. I just need it for the sake of it. And then, of course, the experience on mobile, and especially with something like QR codes, like you need a 5-point description, how to just get an app to do something. Or at the end, you can type in a URL and you're good to go, right? So that's what we wanted to bring to mobile. We want to make mobile much, much easier. And what we had with the web for such a long time, that has worked out pretty well. How can we make that on mobile? And how can we make sure that you're not tied into certain app stores or something like that, but rather have just open content? So if we look back to 1997, we had the first iPhone came out, which was a revolution. It was an amazing user experience. It was something completely new. And Steve Jobs was saying that, sure, we'll just create content through the web. Just write your apps with HTML, and people can access it, and you'll be good, right? And then about a year went by, and they sort of changed their mind. We had Objective-C, we had the proper app store and all of that. And it wasn't really what I personally wanted to see. And I think where it went wrong, in my opinion, is that the problem when you had web apps or web content on iOS was that they couldn't access anything on the device. They couldn't access contacts, phone calls, whatever. They can only render documents, only render web pages. And I think it could have been done much, much better. And I'll sort of get to that later with talking about APIs and making the web platform much, much capable. And I think then we have solutions, like, to me, this is kind of like PhoneGap. You sort of try and think outside the box to solve a problem. But still, though, it's not really what we wanted. Like, they've done great things with PhoneGap, but it's just one way of enabling it. But we need to make sure we have that kind of level from the get-go. So with Firefox OS, basically Firefox OS is a web operating system. It's completely based on web technologies. So everything you see in Firefox OS is HTML5, CSS, and JavaScript. And the point of doing that, we were looking into a number of different options. So how can we get into mobile? How can we make sure that the open web is available on mobile devices, and we actually have developers in control instead of just companies being in control? And if you look at iOS, we can't really have a web browser on iOS because we have a different rendering engine than the one that's being built in. Windows Phone, same thing, we can't install Firefox there. So Android is the only operating system where we can actually have a web browser to begin with on mobile. And so we're just looking into options and sort of tying back into economical abilities of people. How can we make sure that we can have an operating system that will work on low-end devices or affordable devices if you want to, and make sure that everything on it is web-based? So with this operating system, when you boot it up, it basically built up of 3 different layers. So we have Gonk, which is the small kernel just to make it run and access drivers and such. As soon as you boot it up, you go into Gecko, and Gecko is the rendering engine of Firefox. And they have something called Gaia, and Gaia is the user interface in the Firefox OS. So basically, when you start a device, you see a web browser tab showing the content. So everything you see is HTML5. Everything that we have to build the operating system and the UI itself is the same thing that will be available for all the apps. And one part of this that I really like is that it has been open source from day one. Like the first commit, the first day was available on GitHub, and everything we do is going to be available directly. All the work that's happening is just going to be out there. Everyone can see the code, people can do pull requests, they can, well, point out flaws if they find something, which has really, really helped, and we have gotten a ton of good contributions as well. And to begin with, we were looking at low-end devices, and there's an estimate that within the next few years, we're going to have 2 billion more people coming online. And that's a lot of people. And most of them, or the vast majority of them, will do that through mobile. And if you look in South America, you look to Africa, you look to India and China, etc. How can we make sure that their first experience can actually be a proper smartphone experience? So we're not, at this time, really competing with the latest iOS or the latest Android or something like that. This is more about competing with feature phones, like people having old Nokia phones where one button is bigger than the actual display on the phone. How can we give them a smartphone experience for the same price? And then over time, we have developed a number of partnerships with, I think it's 19 right now, 19 different mobile operators and 5 different hardware providers. And one of those is Foxconn. And Foxconn made a statement a few months ago that they're looking into supporting a wide range of devices because they believe that the web is quite a good platform. And if you, especially like with TVs, if you look at TVs, if you ever try to build something from a TV operating system, it's hell. And that's a nice word of putting it. So how can you have the same thing? How can you have the same thing not just in a web browser, but as an app and on tablets and on TVs and whatever else there could be? So they're planning to have a range of 7 different sized devices, so different phones, different tablets, etc., to have the same operating system and the same developer approach for all of them. And we also have a developer phone that's available through eBay, which is sort of just to point out the price reference. So we're looking at around $80 for a device. Unlocked, you can just buy it and run it and install your own things on it as well. And then, of course, step 1 was, okay, let's sure we have a mobile operating system. Great. So step 2, people want apps. And then we can argue back and forth if apps is the best thing, if we should only have URLs, etc. But right now, people want to have the app experience. So then we started looking into building open web apps. So how can we make sure that people can just reuse their existing skills using HTML5, using responsive design and all that, and make sure that all the things that they build run directly on the device. So you don't need to learn a new language, you don't need to use a certain SDK, you can just build things the way you're building for the web, but it will work as an app as well. And I know it doesn't really sound that comforting, but we tried really hard to make sure that you can actually get that experience as a developer. So building an app or having an app format on Firefox OS is basically just the HTML5 code you have plus a manifest file, which is just a JSON file outlining your app itself. And looking at such a manifest file, like this would be the only addition you would need to add to, for instance, a mobile HTML5 app that you have today. You have the manifest file describing your app, which basically has version number, name of the app, launch path, icons for different resolutions, localization and such if you want to, and that's it. This is a complete app that would run on Firefox OS. And we were also looking into different ways of running apps. So we have packaged apps and hosted apps. And hosted apps are basically something that you install on the device as an app, but it will run from your own web server. So you have complete control of the release schedule. You don't need to wait in a line to get reviewed or something like that. Basically, everything runs from wherever you control it. And then you can use app cache and HTML5 or similar to make sure that it works offline as well. Then the other option is package apps. And with package apps, you can take all the files in your app, you zip them up, and then you just install that zip on the device, which means by default they'll be available offline. But also as a package app, if you want to, if you have certain needs to access more things on the hardware or have a higher security clearance, we have a marketplace. And through the marketplace, we can actually make sure that your code is secure enough to do more things on the device. And for that, right now, it needs to be a package app because we can't have code run from any web server that can do really sensitive things on a device. So it's more or less up to your own needs with your app. And we see a number of people who use PhoneGap and Titanium and other approaches, like they build everything with HTML5, but then they need to do a lot of extra work to have the iOS wrapper and Android wrapper and all that. And they wouldn't really need that to have yet another platform with Firefox OS. The only thing they need is the manifest file, and everything would just work. And then, okay, we have the operating system, we have the open web apps. So how do we get to the third part, which actually makes the web layer more capable than before? And with that, we started something called WebAPI. With all the different web APIs, it's basically a number of APIs to access hardware, to have more things that you can do directly on the phone through JavaScript. And of course, we also make sure that you can write something and it's going to work on every platform. So basically, we just take care of all the problems and offer the APIs to you. And one important part of that is standardization. So if we were to invent APIs that no one else supports, it's kind of pointless. Then we're not doing the thing that we want to do. We want to make sure that this will work everywhere. So a number of the APIs have already been standardized, and we're working on standardizing a lot more of them. And we have a couple of members in the device API working group with W3C as well. And looking at the security levels for different apps and different APIs, we have web content. And regular web content is just something that you would run in the web browser in Firefox OS. And then we have installed web apps, which is sort of equivalent to the hosted web apps I was talking about before, that you have an app that's actually installed, but all the content is running from your own web server. Then when it gets a bit more interesting is when we have privileged web apps. And with the privileged web apps, and I'm talking about other APIs before, that means that you can, for instance, access contacts and storage and similar on the device. Then on the right-hand side, you see certified web apps, and right now, those are only the apps that we can build. And that would, for instance, make sure that you can place calls from the phone or something like that. But over time, we want to make sure to expose as many as possible of the certified APIs as well to you as developers. And we have one interesting page for web APIs, and just listing a number of APIs. But the part here that I think is interesting is the right-hand side, where you have the colored columns with D and A and B. And basically D means Firefox on desktop, A means Firefox on Android, and B means boot2gecko, which is the old code name for Firefox OS. And you can see the different coloring here, which gives you a good indication for a certain API. Like, is this API going to be available on all the platforms? Does it make sense to have it on all the platforms? You can also see the security level. Like the blue ones, for instance, are certified, which means that only we can control them for like telephony, for instance. And the green ones will be available to any kind of web content. And we were talking about the manifest file before, and within the manifest file, if you want to access some more APIs on the device, you can just add a permissions part. So you add permissions, and you can say, okay, I want to access contacts and alarms as well. And then you have a description just outlining what are you actually going to do with contacts, and what kind of access do you want? Do you want only read access, read create access? And on MDN, which is the, well, humbly I would say the best documentation website in the world, but that's only my thought, we have a page outlining different APIs, or sorry, the different permissions for APIs. So you can just see what kind of API you want to access, what kind of access you can specify, and how you need to specify that in the manifest file. And with this talk, I'm just going to go through a number of different APIs. It's more like a smorgasbord of things that you can actually do. And some of these are only in Firefox OS. Some of them have been standardized. So you're going to have them in Chrome on Android, for instance, Chrome on desktop, etc. And of course, the goal over time is to make sure that everyone supports these APIs. Instead of inventing a new language or something like that, we want to make sure that with these APIs, that the web platform in a short time can get so much richer. One of the APIs is the battery status API. And it's basically about just checking the battery level on your device right now. And this one has already been standardized. So you have navigator.battery. It's going to work on desktop computers as well in Firefox and Chrome right now. And you can check a few properties like battery level. You can get a Boolean, whether it's charging or not. And you have charging time and discharging time. And basically charging time is how long time it's going to take until your device is fully charged, and discharging until it's fully discharged. And then a few events like charging change, basically, did you connect it to adapter right now or did you unplug it? And one part here, unless you're building a dashboard to just show the battery or something, that makes it interesting is when you start combining it with other APIs. Like if you have a heavy syncing operation or something like that, you can also see that the battery level for the user is not very high right now. So you might want to avoid some actions depending on how much battery the user actually has. You can make it more like a seamless experience for them, and instead of starting something and then they'll run out of battery. We have the notification API, and notifications look like, if you're using Android, it looks very similar to Android. You get a small thing at the top, and you can slide down. And everything that hasn't been standardized yet has the MOS prefix, and as soon as we get it standardized, of course, that's going to go away. But you can have a MOS notification, and then when you create a notification, it takes 3 different parameters. So the first parameter is basically the title of your notification. The second one is the actual text or description for a notification. And the third one, which is optional, is an icon if you want to have an exclamation sign for sort of warning or similar. So then we have screen orientation API, and it's more about controlling user experience. When the user starts up the app, you can lock the orientation to a certain mode. So for instance, you can lock it to portrait or landscape, especially for most of the games, it's locking it to landscape. But you also have a few other options. Like you can have a landscape primary, for instance, which means that no matter how you're holding the device right now, it's going to go into landscape. But then if you start turning it around, then it'll adapt. It's portrait or landscape. We have the vibration API. It used to be called the vibrator API, but people sort of had a wrong connection to that, and you had giggles for 10 minutes, and we sort of want to get past that, so it's vibration right now. And with vibration, it's just about making the device vibrate. So you pass in a number of milliseconds. So the first one here means that the device is going to vibrate for 1 second. The second one is a bit more interesting, where you can pass in a pattern. When you pass in the pattern, you basically have the array with 200 milliseconds and when it's going to vibrate, and then it's going to be silent for 100, and then it's going to vibrate for 200, etc. Which basically means you can have your own Morse patterns or write your own vibration songs or something like that. Please don't. I know people will anyway, but at least I can beg for it. And we've seen some interesting apps with that, like navigation apps. If you're riding your bike, for instance, and you have your phone in your pocket and you get to an intersection, and if you're supposed to turn left, it's going to vibrate once, and then if you're going to turn right, it's going to vibrate twice, etc. Just small things to make it easier. And except for the marketplace that we have where we offer payments, you can also have in-app payments. And this is vastly simplifying the process, but you have a MOS pay method, and depending on your payment provider, you have your JSM token. And then you can pass in that token, and then we have success and error event handlers. So if the payment goes through, so you can buy more Smurf berries or something vital, you will get that back and you can work with it. And we have this small library on GitHub as well, which is the receipt verifier, which you can use to test out payments directly in your app and get the full in-app payment experience. And I think the simplest way of using that is the receipts.prompter method. We just pass in a store URL, the support HTML, and whether to verify it or not. And in a simulator, and I'll get back to that, you can also specify for your app if you want the receipts to be valid by default or invalid by default or refunded. So you can just get a different user experience and see how that actually acts out on the device. And one part where it gets interesting for me, like I was going to say a JavaScript boy, because JavaScript old man now, but the interesting part with JavaScript, and for me, starting out as a web developer, like, gray backgrounds and HR elements, and then we had mouse over and all that. It's pretty cool to get to something like device proximity right now. Like through JavaScript, I can detect with my phone how close am I holding it to the screen, or how far away am I getting. So you have a device proximity event, and it returns a value in centimeters. Metric system, yay. I'm European, so I'm sort of biased, but still. So you get back the value in centimeters, but you also have a max and min property. So with the max property, you can see the sensor in this specific device, like how far away can I get from a physical device and it will still detect this distance. Minimum, of course, is the opposite. How close can I get and it will still notice. And in my mind, I thought it would be, you know, meters, like it would be a long distance and you could have Highlander apps and have sword fights and all that. In reality, the highest value I've seen is 10 centimeters, which is sort of not that much fun. But I think it's also going to be dependent on the different devices and on the different sensors. So it's more about a hardware limitation right now than you know, anything with the API. Another cool thing is ambient light. How can you detect the light conditions where the user is right now? So what you can do with that and to adapt the experience is, if you're in a dim living room, for instance, or if you're out in the bright sunlight, you can have a different CSS file, you can have different contrast, and just help to make it easier for them. And with that, you have a device light event. And device light returns a lux value, which most people haven't worked with. But a good point of reference is that if you get a lux value below 50, it's going to be really, really dark, like you're covering the sensor with your hand. And if you get over about 10,000, 12,000, that means that you're rubbing it against a light bulb. I've tried. It's my job, right? And one part, which isn't specifically a web API per se, is page visibility. And being Swedish, I need to have snow in my slides. It's kind of mandatory. And if you have an app, you have a visibility change event. So you have one simple property, which basically means document hidden means that your app is in the background right now. And the opposite, of course, is when your app gets focus. So then you can, you know, depending what you want to load or what kind of experience you want to have or playing sound or something like that, you can adapt that to the actual visibility of the app. And then talking about privileged APIs, there are only a few right now, and we're trying to make, well, more of them from the certified APIs. But it's about accessing things on the device, like storage, building your own browser with the browser API, TCP socket, contacts. We also have system XHR, which is basically how can you do cross-domain requests without using cores or something similar. You can just use it directly from your app and do an AJAX request to any URL. And looking at device storage, we have navigator.getDeviceStorage, and you can have a path like the videos folder, for instance. And then you can have a cursor. So basically, you just enumerate over all the files that you have within that folder. And if you have a success event and you actually get a pointer with the cursor result, you can use the file API in HTML5 to detect that the file that you're seeing right now, that it has the right MIME type. It's actually a proper video file. But then you can also create a test player on the fly. So you can get all the files and see if they not only are supported, but if they actually play as well. And then you can show a list to the user like, okay, well, these 3 out of 5 or something will actually play on your own device. And I think one good middle ground here with the different APIs and security levels is something called Web Activities. And we saw Google working with Web Intents for a couple of years, which is kind of frozen right now. But I think it's going to be resumed, and then we talk a lot together. And hopefully it'll turn into something good together. So with Web Activities, we have a much smaller scope. And it's basically how can we find the middle ground between user approval of a certain action and still giving you access as a developer to doing as much as possible. So one example, for instance, could be how you would interact with the camera on the device. And when you call a web activity, you specify the kind of activity you call. It's very similar to intents on Android as well. So if you call an activity, like the pick activity, you get a list of all the different apps on the device that will support that activity. So in this case, I want to pick an image file, and then the operating system tells me that, sure, the wallpaper supports that, the gallery app supports that, but you can also, for instance, go directly into the camera and take a picture. And when you create a MOS activity, you list a few options. So what kind of activity, like the view activity, And then with data, you specify what kind of files or content that you're looking for. Like, okay, I only want to do view for PNG files. And you have success and error event handlers to deal with. So, for instance, if you go into the camera and you take a picture and you have a success handler, then you get the content back or the picture back as a blob. So you can work directly with it in JavaScript. It doesn't have to be a file. And we were looking at the manifest file before, and same thing with activities. Like if your app that you're building supports a certain activity on the device, you can say that, okay, my app supports the share activity, but I only support it for PNG and GIF files. And when my app is being called for sharing, I want you to go into the sharing.html file. So I can just choose what to present to the user directly. And then you have disposition, which basically means window, and that is leaving the current app and going into my app. But you could also do inline, which means stay in context in the current app, show this activity, and then go back again. And talking about the future, and one thing that I think is important is when we have all these APIs, we can talk about the things that we have today, but I think it's also really good to talk about where we're going in the future. What do we plan on supporting? And of course, it's also an indication of, well, A, the things that we didn't have time to do in the 1.0 version of Firefox OS, but also B, to know what we're thinking about, what we think are the best use cases. So here's a list of a few of the APIs that we're looking at right now or working on making better. And it comes down to, well, resource locking and NFC and web USB and such. We're also talking about getting WebRTC in there, which is, well, on its way, which is really, really exciting, and calendar API, spell check, etc. And one API that I like, and I usually try and use different operating systems for a while and see what I prefer between, you know, what do I like in iOS, what do I like in Android, etc. And one area where I think Android is far superior to iOS is the ability to have any kind of keyboard. So we're trying to give the same experience there. Like on Android, you can have Swift key or swipe or something like that. And same thing here. How can we make sure that you can have, well, another keyboard experience if you want to? So we had one developer implement something, an external one, really quickly, which was basically like when you want to get the cursor at a certain point in text on mobile, it's really hard to hit the right spot, and you keep on tapping, and then you mark the word, etc. So he implemented something that if you hold down the shift key, you can do a 2-finger swipe to move the cursor around in the text, which makes it way, way easier to work with. And that was kind of a 1-hour hack, and just using this API. And looking at the default installed web apps from Mozilla right now, if you get a Firefox OS device, is of course a web browser. So it's kind of a web browser and a web browser, so Inception style. But then of course we have messages and calendar and calling and all that. And overall, it's a good list of different things to work with. All the things that you would need like as a basic package on a smartphone. And also, if you're building apps, you know, whether it's for Firefox OS or any kind of mobile web app, all the code in Gaia, which is the UI of Firefox OS, is also available on GitHub. So if there's an app that you like in Firefox OS, you can go in and just copy the code. Or if there's an app that you think sucks, you can just go in and do a pull request and make it better. And I think initially for the first release of Firefox OS, we had about 300 contributors just making the UI better with small fixes and patches and ideas. Which is also the way I really think open source should be. Like, these are the things we're doing, but we don't have any false beliefs that we can do everything best in the world and no one else can make it better. So it's more about sharing that and get other people's input. And sort of as a side note, and there was a talk this morning as well about web components. And we're looking more and more into web components and how we can make sure that you, as a web developer, have something more like modules. How can you have it really, really easy in the code and you have the look and the interaction built in? So we have something called Mozilla Brick, which is also on GitHub. And it's basically a number of different UI components that you can have in your apps. So you can have Flipbox, which is that you have a certain content and then you click on something and it just flips it around like a card. So you have everything everything is put in the app as X tags. You have X-flipbox, for instance. And then you can have a click event for a button, and then you have built-in methods like toggle. So you can call the flipbox, you keep calling toggle, and it just shows the other side. And the initial components we have right now are app bar, which is just a bar at the top. We have calendars and date pickers and decks and such. And we also try to look closely at what Google are doing with Polymer and basically make sure that components get better and better. So it goes faster to build good web apps, but also easier as well. And getting started with Firefox OS and compared to other mobile operating systems is that we have a Firefox OS simulator, which is just an extension that you install in Firefox. So when you install this extension, you have the operating system running in its own window, and then you have a dashboard and you can install any kinds of apps. And I would say, and I really want to stress this, that usually when I talk about Firefox OS, and if you compare it to all the other mobile platforms, without naming any, they want you to build apps for their platform specifically. I wouldn't say that. I want you to build proper mobile web apps. I want you to use open web technologies. Then an upside of that is that they're going to work out of the box in Firefox OS. But I don't want you to do something only for Firefox OS. I want you to do it for the mobile web. So, and the point with that is, and the way I try my stuff as well, like if I have something with responsive design, for instance, I can point out the URL directly in the simulator and see how it runs on the device. So I don't need to add any extra line of code, any extra kind of workaround. I just point out the URL and see if it runs. And then on top of that, if I need to access certain APIs to do more, sure, I could, but I don't have to. And I think that's the way it should be. As long as it's responsive, it should work on all the mobile platforms. It shouldn't be, weeks of extra work of just adapting to every platform out there, because we have too many platforms, too many different devices, too many different aspect ratios and such. And one thing I put together, especially with web activities and web APIs, is something called the boilerplate app, which is just small code snippets how things would work in Firefox OS. If I want to access the screen orientation API, how would I do that? And I made sure that all the snippets, they're not dependent on any library. Like, it's not up to me to say, oh, you should use jQuery or Dojo or something like that. So all the snippets are standalone. You can take the code and they will run out of the box. And I still think, and I get that question all the time, like, okay, well, what kind of framework should I use? That's completely up to your needs. Like, there's so many factors that come into play. Like, I could say something, but that would only work for me. I'm not sure that it will work for you and your team and your background and your experience, etc. So probably my own vision here, but if people keep on telling you that one framework is superior no matter what, you should be a bit wary. And something that we have, and it's only in the Aurora releases of Firefox right now, which is basically test releases before we finalize things, is something called the App Manager. And in the App Manager, it's kind of a dashboard on steroids for building web apps in general. And then you can access different devices and have remote debugging and such. And talking about the marketplace, with the Firefox marketplace, it's one way of getting attention for your app. It's one way of getting visibility. But you don't have to use the marketplace. You could offer apps from your own website completely if you want to. So it's just one way, like, for instance, if you want to have payments, or if you want to have access to certain APIs that you need a higher security clearance for, then the marketplace is good for you. But it's one of the options. And as part of the marketplace, we also have the Developer Hub. And in the Developer Hub, you have different sections with ideas and help, how to design things, how to build things, and also how you can publish your app directly. And I guess also one of the points with this talk and the web in general is to try things out. So a number of months ago, my oldest daughter turned 8, and they had a small birthday party, and we thought, let's give them these letter cookies. You know, when one cookie is a letter of its own, like the letter L, the letter M, etc. Because they can spell now. Let's give it to them and see if they're actually going to spell a word. And it took about 30 seconds, and this was the first word that we got. Which is kind of terrifying and kind of a shining moment. But at the same time, this is what I like, right? And then I see with Firefox OS the same thing. Like, we put the code out there, we put the possibilities out there, but you want to see people hack it and break it and find flaws or find ways of making it better, because I think it's the unexpected that makes it better. And for me, the way I see it is that mobile and the mobile web in general could be awesome. And I really think we should strive for that, because it can be so much better. So please try web APIs out, and please also talk with the other major players. Demand to have support for these APIs. We shouldn't have to do a 3-week dance just to make it work on 4 different mobile platforms. We should just build things that work. We shouldn't spend time with packaging. We should spend time being creative. So that's my point of the day. Go out, have some fun, and thank you. Questions? Yes.
Like Android, is there any inbuilt support for the device density and the choosing your activities, or is it just by the media queries and CSS device density?
Oh, with density? It's basically everything that you would have in Firefox or Chrome in general. Like you say, media queries and also JavaScript ways of testing the DPI and resolution and such like that. So there's nothing beyond that.
And Android does have this thing called the background services, right? Where you can run something of your app in the background. Is there something of that?
So on the question about background services, right now it's a bit dependent on performance of the devices as well. So we don't have any process API, for instance, that we expose. So it's more about that if you have your app running and then the user leaves it, your app will keep on running in the background, and I'm talking about the visibility API. But it's also about having low spec phones. So it basically means if you start doing something else that's more resource intensive, you're going to get a mem kill for your app in the background, and then it's gone, right? So at this time, we're not offering any multi-process support that you can sort of hook into, only whether your app is visible or not, and things like that. And I think it's a good question. It comes up a lot. So we'll see over time, and especially if you start talking about mid-end devices and high-end devices, it's going to make sense. On the low-end devices, it doesn't really work right now. So I think over time, we'll probably see something like that, or at least exposing the information to you. Okay then, thanks.